Okay, thank you very much. Our next presentation is from the Centre for Shared Education at Queen's University. Just refer you to the Clerk's cover note at page 53 and to relevant papers, including briefing notes from the Centre for Shared Education at Queen's. And I can just advise everyone that we have Hansard, so everything which you say will be recorded. Can I welcome all our witnesses? We have Professor Joanne Hughes, Professor Tony Gallagher, Dr. Gavin Duffy, and Professor Miles Hewstone. You're all very welcome. Thank you very much for being with us today. And can I ask you to make an opening statement, and members will follow up with some questions.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to say a few words and then invite my colleagues to introduce themselves and say a few words. So my name is Joanne Hughes. I'm Director of the Centre for Shared Education at Queen's. The centre was established in 2012. Our vision is as an applied and interdisciplinary centre which is committed to researching and promoting evidence-based practice in all areas of education. Many of us within the centre have been involved in exploring issues relating to education in divided societies for many years. The shared education approach is based on an analysis of the existing education system in Northern Ireland and efforts to promote community relations within it. And it pointed to a twofold approach to community relations in Northern Ireland and indeed in other divided societies. So we've had short-term contact initiatives or full immersion integrated education. The shared model, which is theory-informed, kind of plugs the gap between those initiatives which are known to be largely ineffective, the short-term contact initiatives, and integrated education, which is effective but has had limited impact or appeal. We have defined shared education as collaborative activity between schools from different sectors that's underpinned by a commitment to reconciliation objectives and can contribute towards school improvement, access to opportunity and more positive intergroup relations in divided societies. And when we talk about theory-informed, we refer to two bodies of theory. The first is contact theory, which asserts that contact between different groups, provided it meets certain conditions, can be effective in reducing prejudice and promoting more positive social attitudes, not just towards the individuals involved in the contact situation. This is not about making exceptions to the rule, but towards the outgroup as a whole. The conditions for effective contact are listed in our submission, but a key point to mention is that contact should allow for the development of more intimate ties, usually associated with friendship. And in this respect, it should be sustained over time. Identity should also at some level be salient in contact encounters in order to maximise its effectiveness. The second body of theory relates to networks and collaboration, and this theory highlights characteristics of effective collaboration in relation to school improvement. The work of the centre is organised around three interrelated strands of activity. We have a substantial programme of national and international research. In terms of our programme activity, we have delivered a shared education programme in Northern Ireland and are involved in developing and delivering similar programmes in other divided jurisdictions. We've developed, in terms of education, bespoke training programmes for practitioners and policymakers involved in the delivery of shared education, and we're also developing master's pathways. Our research findings are clear that increasing contact between pupils from different divided groups, in the case of Northern Ireland, Catholics and Protestants, has the effect of reducing prejudice, increasing trust and generally promoting a more positive response to the outgroup or the other. We've shown that this happens in a range of educational settings: integrated schools, separate schools that have a significant proportion of pupils from the other community, shared education contexts where pupils have an opportunity to engage in sustained curriculum-based interaction. We've also shown that the effect of sustained contact is diminished for free school meal recipients, although there's still an effect for these pupils. We also know that outcomes are different for pupils in more divided communities. For them, there is sometimes a dissonance between the values promoted by the school, which are around mutual understanding, respect for difference and so on, and the values that are valorised in the local community or the home environment, which are sometimes to do with suspicion or sense of threat. Our research also suggests that the current grammar-secondary divide can be a hurdle to sharing. It can be difficult for secondary school pupils to attend the local grammar, and there have been some issues around them feeling intimidated. The intersection between faith and class in Northern Ireland may exacerbate this problem. There's generally a receptiveness to shared education in Northern Ireland schools, and our research has shown that this is related to the foregrounding of other educational priorities, which means that teachers don't feel under the same pressure to engage with issues that are controversial, although many do. There are educational benefits to be accrued from participation in sharing, not least in terms of the entitlement framework, and there may be additional benefits. Separate schools are a cherished representation of community and individual identity, and a value of sharing, not just in Northern Ireland as we found, but in other divided jurisdictions, is that separate schools, which many people have a strong attachment to, are perceived not to be threatened. In terms of the collaborative process, schools have been remarkably engaged and ingenious in terms of overcoming some of the barriers that can arise. And these include practical issues like the coordination of timetables, pastoral care policies, transport, and community relations work to minimise opposition to the initiative, so communicating with parents, working with local community representatives and local community elites. Schools have also worked collaboratively with local agencies to tackle issues that are particular to a locality. In terms of what might enable shared education, a policy framework that requires schools to engage in intersectoral sharing reflected in inspection criteria for schools. Shared education should be a compulsory element of ITE, initial teacher education, reflected in modules or workshops on diversity in the classroom, for example, or collaboration in practice, and this should also be reflected in continuing professional development. The delivery of shared education should reflect optimal conditions for effective contact and effective collaboration, and these are outlined in our longer submission. And finally, there is a potential tension between foregrounding educational outcomes over reconciliation outcomes to maximise participation by schools, and the need to keep salient issues of difference in order to maximise the generalisability of attitudinal and behavioural change amongst participants. So that's my statement. I'd like to introduce my colleagues, Dr. Gavin Duffy, who's a researcher within the Centre, Professor Tony Gallagher, Pro-Vice Chancellor at Queen's, and Professor Hewstone from Oxford University, who is Director of the Oxford Centre for the Study of Intergroup Relations. So, Tony, if you want to.
Okay, just two quick points. Thanks very much, first of all, for the invitation to come along. But two quick points. One is as Joanne sort of alluded to, some of the evidence. The nature of the challenge in different parts of Northern Ireland, whenever schools are trying to work collaboratively, is very different. And one of the things that's been very important in the work that we've been doing with school collaborations is to develop bespoke models in different places, recognise the importance of context, but give a lot of autonomy and influence to teachers to work with this and trying to develop the best way to do this. And I think that's a particularly important part of the approach we have taken to shared education. Second point, I suppose, is that the terminology shared education has now become so ubiquitous. It's been applied to a vast range of different things. We're very clear that when we talk about shared education, we're talking about very robust work with serious collaboration and engagement between schools that's sustained and is long-term, and changes the nature of the relationship between schools in a way which actually is going to lead to very significant positive changes for the young people, for the teachers, for the parents and for the wider communities. So we have a very particular understanding of what shared education means, even though I suppose the way the term is used now, it's covering a much wider umbrella, stuff which we wouldn't necessarily always see as falling within our understanding of it. So just a couple of quick points to begin. Niles, do you want to?
To add to the points made so far, I'd like to say also thank you very much for talking to us. My colleagues in England sometimes have great difficulty getting to talk to anyone about the policy implications of their work. I've always found ears in Northern Ireland much more open, so thank you for that. I'd like to add to what Professor Hughes said, that one of the other things we're able to show in our work is the value of contact, not just in changing attitudes to what we call primary outgroups, the most obvious outgroups that people come into contact with, but also secondary outgroups, so that actually one of the benefits of promoting positive mixing between groups such as Catholic and Protestant students is that they also develop more tolerant attitudes towards ethnic minorities, for example. Another of the things that we focused on in our work is that the benefits of contact don't just accrue from direct face-to-face contact. I couldn't miss the opportunity to hear my colleague Roger Austin speak to you just before I came in. I'm a great fan of the implications of what new technology can offer in the kind of work that he does. And I smiled at your understanding that we had not yet got these two universities together, because the links are absolutely obvious. I think you can see that the opportunities for sequential work where people might begin their contact in the kind of relaxed confines, distance learning through ICT, then you organise face-to-face contact, and then, as he said, the face-to-face contact is followed by a burst of online contact. So these things work together. Contact is not always positive. Contact can be negative, and one of the ironies is that where you bring people together, you're likely to see more positive contact, but you're also likely to see more negative contact. You can't possibly be bullied by a boy from the out-group if you don't go to school with boys from the out-group. The good news there, however, is that in our very recent work, we find that even though there may be greater evidence for negative contact in these mixed settings, positive contact has this very clear buffering effect. Prior positive contact buffers you, it strengthens you. It means that you don't respond to that negative contact with an increase in your own intolerance or aggression towards the other side. And finally, just to show that we are not we are optimists, but we're not idealists. And one of the things we always have to be aware of is that we don't create conditions for mixing or desegregation, only then to find, as they did do in schools in the United States after they desegregated in 1954, that children themselves choose to resegregate. You go in through the front door, the black kids are all on the basketball team and the football team, the white kids are doing the school newspaper and the tennis club. So you have to be alert to that possibility, and you have to work, once you've gone inside the doors, to promote mixing at various kinds of levels. And the work we're doing with the centre right at the moment that is completely new is we're looking in detail at people's social networks. We're looking at the intimacy of people's friendship groups to see if we can ascertain just how close the relations are between members of different communities in their friendship networks.
Morning, committee. My name is Gavin Duffy. I'm a research fellow at the School of Education, and I've been attached to the Sharing Education programme since around 2011. My kind of research takes a different tact in the sense that my work has been essentially qualitative and has been around trying to provide contextual data and contextual information about what actually happens inside schools and the relationships between schools. So a lot of my work has been underpinned by the notion of collaborative effectiveness, and I'm particularly interested in trying to draw out what makes a strong partnership, what makes an effective partnership, and so hopefully I can get an opportunity to talk to you about that through this morning.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for your presentation, and thank you for your very detailed and paper which has come to the committee as part of your evidence. There are quite a number of questions probably that we could ask around this, and time is always limited, but a lot of your work is very much about the education focus. And I think that's been very clear, particularly in the presentations which we received earlier with Cross and Passion and Ballycastle High School, and I think members couldn't not be impressed by the work which is going on there around shared education. But you have also talked in your papers about the limited reach of integrated education, and also the suspicion that there exists within our communities. But do you see a time when shared education will be mainstreamed?
Well, I think we're probably not far off that point at the moment in many senses. When you look at the range of programmes which are being put in place from the department, potentially through the European Peace Money, the Shared Campuses Initiative, there's a whole range of things which are we're on the cusp, I think, of going into a situation where the working assumption is that schools should work with other schools, not just to promote cohesion, but also because it's good educationally and it makes more effective use of resources. So I think we're very close to the point where we can get to there. And that one of the advantages of the shared education approach, the idea of using collaboration, is that it's possible to do that through across as much of the system as possible without the sort of the tensions and difficulties involved with threats to identity. It sort of squares the circle in a way which is part of its attraction. And if we can get it into that sort of situation, then it's going to change the nature of relationships between people, and who knows, that opens up all sorts of possibilities for further development and evolution in the future.
And you talked about bespoke models and contextualising situations, and really that there isn't a one-size-fits-all in order to achieve the outcome. Are there particular examples which you found to have maybe surpassed your expectation whenever you've gone into to looking at a solution for schools in certain areas?
Well, I suppose Gavin can maybe say a little bit about some of the work in sort of Derry, Londonderry around the Contested Spaces project, because there's some amazing stuff happening there. But I mean, a case like Ballycastle, which you mentioned, I mean, one of the things which I find incredibly inspirational about the way that they're approaching it is they have agreed as two schools basically to hook their fates together through the Shared Campus initiative by each delivering a part of the curriculum that the other depends on. That speaks to a level of trust between the schools which I just find amazing. I think you see a similar sort of thing in Limavady, where the level of engagement between the schools and the imagination and creativity that the teachers in the schools are showing, I think, is also impressive. There's been a few situations like that where teachers, given the space and the freedom to try things and to do things, have responded in a way which I just think is amazing. And as part of the value of the work, I think, is to, rather than simply imposing a particular template or model on schools and then requiring them to do it, giving teachers space to be part of the creating a solution, allowing them to try things sometimes that don't work, but learning from that, I think, has been a very valuable part of the whole experience at making the models work. So, apart from that, one of the main general lessons that we have taken out of working with the collaborative networks over the last 6-7 years is that the more points of contact between the schools, the better. Because the more intersections there are, the tighter the interweave, as it were, between the schools, then the more likely it will be sustained into the future. And the sort of work that Miles and Joanne is doing is demonstrating then the positive consequences that can arise from that. And it's creating a situation where that becomes permanent. That becomes the way in which things just happen. A new habit of reality, if you like. So rather than sort of small programmes or connections on particular sort of tightly defined areas of activity, encourage as many connections as possible. And Gavin, do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yep, the Foyle Contested Space Education Partnership based in Derry, Londonderry, was an alternative model of collaboration, and it effectively evolved out of the first phase of the Shared Education Programme, which was between 2007 and 2010. And it was funded by OFM, DFM, Atlantic Philanthropies, and it was part of their Interfacing Contested Space Programme. This model is reasonably unique in Northern Ireland in the sense that it's made up of eight schools. So 5 of them are primary schools, 3 are post-primary schools, and they're obviously across sectors. What's incredible about this is it was a combination of an educational and a social approach to addressing social need areas. So there were 5 particular social need areas that schools collectively decided that these were issues for them, and so conversations took place prior to the formation of the partnership, where the schools tried to identify common social need areas, and they identified 5 areas. One of them was antisocial behaviour, another was improving community relations in a contested space setting, another was to look at the impact of substance misuse, and then to look collectively at areas such as health and sexual resilience, and also looking at the appropriate and safe use of the internet and social media. Now, as a social needs kind of based programme, it was important for the schools to locate that within the curriculum, because that's part of what the core business of what the schools do. And this ran from Key Stage 3 right through to Key Stage 3. So it basically was a programme for pupils aged 8 right up to the age of 15. And so the programme was delivered on a shared basis, and it exposed young people to different cultural and religious practices along the way. And it required the collaboration and the collaboration of teachers and principals and senior leaders within schools. And so with that was a partnership infrastructure that was established to try to support the partnership. So to give you an idea of the type of numbers involved, there were 1,161 pupils involved in this programme, and this was a case of 1,000 odd pupils moving between schools on a weekly basis for a period of 3 years. To support that, then there was an infrastructure of 8 principals, 3 vice principals, 35 teachers, and an external primary coordinator. And part of what emerged out of this partnership for us was, well, for me, it was about being able to provide contextual evidence of the practice of shared education. But There's also an opportunity for us to be able to identify effective collaboration as well, and the partnership, and from a research perspective, was able to represent quite a number of perspectives, and that of the pupils, of teachers, of school leaders, and of parents. It was also an opportunity as well for the primary voice to be heard. From what I understand, the primary voice in terms of shared education is relatively quiet, and so this was an opportunity to kind of get the perspective of the primary schools across. And the big thing was that it demonstrated two things: social and educational impact. And if you can bear with me, in terms of the social impacts, I mean, we're talking about encouraging the movement, as I said, of over 1,000 pupils, educators and pupils across contested space settings. Now, a piece of research done by Ellen Roche in Queen's suggested that there is a thing called bounded contentment, and it's this idea that there are over generations there's a reluctance to tend to move in between each other's communities in a contested space setting. So we are talking about communities such as Derry and Londonderry, or places like North Belfast, which have often been described as a patchwork quilt, and there's a tendency, I think, with communities to locate themselves within their own communities and not to move. And so that was an important point, that we had over 1,000 pupils and roughly 40 educators moving in between, and hundreds of parents. It provided an opportunity for meaningful contact between participants from different cultural and religious backgrounds. We have evidences of that from the research, that it reduced prejudices, that it challenged ethnic and denominational isolation. Social relationships began to form as well. So these social relationships are friendships between young people. They're friendships both on a personal and a professional basis between teachers and between school leaders. But we also found evidences of these things extending beyond the classroom, and things like social media were a great way for young people to engage with one another outside of the school environment. The partnership also connects schools in the community and making stronger links between agencies such as statutory agencies and voluntary agencies. In terms of educational impacts then, so the Contested Space Partnership established and supported a sustainable cross-sectoral partnership of schools in what is perhaps one of the most highly contested spaces in Northern Ireland. It developed a cross-sectoral teacher network, which is really important, and from that came personal development opportunities and capacity building. It also established a collaborative school leadership network. Some of our leaders described the whole role of being a principal as being quite a lonely job, and connecting 8 principals together was actually quite a phenomenal thing. It provided regular and sustained education between Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3. And it also provided a unique opportunity to address social needs, but to address the social needs within the curriculum, so between PDMU and Learning for Life and Work at Key Stage 3. And lastly, the collaboration, from our perspective, has led to school improvement.
Okay. Tony, you mentioned that the term shared education is now being very widely used.
Yeah.
And perhaps we do need a very clear definition of what shared education is. Now, I know that you provided a definition, but do you believe that maybe needs to be refined? And have you had any conversations with the department in the lead up to them developing their policy paper on shared education?
Well, Joanne led the work on the centre in formulating the definition of the work there, and it partly reflects the international work that some of us have been involved in. Joanne maybe said a little bit about that, but if you think about the definition in the MAG, the Ministerial Advisory Group, I mean, I think we're quite comfortable with that. The key thing is that shared education is work that involves work between schools from different sectors, that's focused on a curriculum that's sustained and regular and tries to create these new habits of practice. The traditional sort of EMU type approach was one-off projects that brought people together for a while, did something, and then they scattered again. There's some very worthy work that's been done in recent years that is like that on a more enhanced level, but unless it works to establish sustainable networks and collaborative networks between people, then it's very difficult to see how that can actually change the nature of practice within schools and within classrooms. And unless you change what's happening within and between schools, then there's no reason to imagine why anything else will change in relation to attitudes, school improvement and all the rest of it. John, do you want to say something about the definition? Just think it into the international.
Well, just to say that the centre is involved in some international activity. We've been working for the last 3 or 4 years in Macedonia, for example, to help them develop a model for shared education which is based on the Northern Ireland model. And we've been working with the Ministry of Education there and senior policy officials. I don't know how much you know about Macedonia, but they have a separate school system for ethnic Albanians and Macedonians that came out of their peace agreements. They'd formerly integrated schools which have become separate. And the kids in the ethnic Albanian schools are educated in Albanian and in Macedonian, so there's a language issue as well. And the shared education model that's been developed there is looking at aspects of the curriculum wherein there is minimal verbal instruction, but the kids can actually come together. Sometimes these separate schools actually work within the same building, and the kids attend them on a shift basis.
Okay, and just in relation to conversations that you've had with the department in drafting policy, have you had those conversations?
Yeah, we're talking to members of the Inspectorate who are developing a framework for evaluating and assessing the impact of the programme, the Delivering Social Change programme, that's likely to be sort of formally announced quite soon. We talk to officials from the department all the time. They talk to a lot of different people, and I think one of the things that we're impressed at is their willingness to talk to a wide range of voices and use that to try to inform and shape the initiative. I suppose what we're saying to them is that there isn't a one-size-fits-all model here. There isn't a fixed, rigid template. They need to give a degree of responsibility and autonomy to teachers to allow them to help shape things, and they've got to allow the programme to be adaptable, and the assessment frameworks, the evaluation frameworks, to be adaptable as well, to recognise that we're dealing with problems for which there is no easy solution, and so part of the challenge for everyone involved is to work together to find new solutions, and that does mean having a certain degree of tolerance of failure, because you can learn from that. That's the only way you're going to create innovative solutions. So yeah, we've talked to them quite a lot, continue to talk to them, and are very impressed with the officials and inspector, their preparedness and their willingness to take on board the sort of evidence that Miles and Joanne and others are feeding into the system.
Thank you. Mr. Lunn.
Yeah, thanks, Chairman, and thank you very much for your presentation. It's good to see you again. I'm afraid the technology has let me down once again, so I haven't actually read the full paper. I just had it at 10 o'clock. Clearly, your shared education project is on a roll at the moment, and I couldn't deny that there's a lot of money to be thrown at it, and hopefully a lot of benefit to come out of it. So what I can't quite understand is the perception that's developing of hostility, or a level of hostility towards the integrated sector. And as I actually said in your presentation, Joanne, can I just read that wee bit? Research has shown that integrated education, while an effective mechanism for relationship building, has only limited appeal. That in itself flies in the face of every poll I've seen for the last 5 years. You go on to say the overwhelming majority of parents, where such schools, integrated schools, are an option, opting to send their children to separate schools. Again, that flies in the face of the expressed desire of parents who frequently say that if there was an integrated school available, they would either send their children to it or at least consider sending their children to it. So, why do you make a comment like that?
Well, although the surveys have been saying for many years, around between 60 and 80% of parents are saying that they would favour integrated education, it's not reflected in their behaviour. They're not, even in cases where it is an option, there are schools that are undersubscribed that are integrated schools.
Yeah, there's undersubscribed schools right across every sector and right across Northern Ireland. The integrated sector, and I don't want to deliberately phrase this review in terms of shared and integrated. It was my idea, not shared versus. So don't be thinking I'm on a mission here of some kind, because I'm not. But when you've only got 62 schools out of 1,150, clearly there's going to be a lot of situations where there just isn't an integrated school available, and that's part of the problem. It's not because the parents who would like to send their children somewhere like that choose not to. They just can't. Geographical.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose where you would expect, where you have 80% of, in a survey saying that they would send their children to an integrated school, you would expect that every integrated school would be bursting, and that's not the case. Now, that's not to say we have no hostility at all towards integrated education. Okay. In fact, a lot of our research evidence has endorsed integrated education as a way of promoting better relations between Protestants and Catholics. There's no question. I mean, maybe Miles wants to say something about that, but that's...
Yeah, if I could just jump in on that point. Various presentations that we've made, both in our articles peer-reviewed journals and presentations here to teachers, we've always emphasised that actually we see integrated as what we're trying to match. There's so much good practice there that one is trying to achieve also, and you need to make sure that if you offer anything else as an alternative, you do at least as well as that. We're also always open to the idea that however carefully we have measured and however much research we've done already, there may be some measurement we haven't used yet, which might just show that there is this additional effectiveness of integrated schools. This is why we're doing the work now on social networks, because we thought that it was possible that the integrated education would actually be promoting these really mixed, integrated social networks of children. In other words, getting to some deeper level of integration that other schools were not yet reaching. So our eyes are very much open.
Can I maybe just add one thing, Trevor? Because I understand that we've talked often about this apparent conundrum between the opinion poll evidence and the reality. And my sense of this is that when people are responding to an opinion poll, they're offering a preference in almost an abstract sense. But because I have lots of conversations with lots of parents in lots of different situations, I think whenever parents are making a choice about a school for their child, it's no longer an abstract choice. They're making a choice between a number of very specific schools in their very specific area. And so the reputation of local schools becomes very, very important. And that's why in any particular area, they may prefer, in an abstract sense, a particular type of school. But whenever they're choosing between 3 or 4 actual schools, there's one of those schools that in and of itself has a good reputation, and that's what they choose. And that's not always an integrated school. As Joanne said, just to reinforce the point in case it needs reinforced, I've always been a strong supporter of the integrated sector and worked with them. And I think the integrated schools by and large are great. But the problem is that even the most optimistic target is for 10% of the school-age population. And we're concerned about the other 90% to try and ensure that everyone in the school system has the opportunity of a strong and positive an experience as possible.
Okay, well, you actually led me on to my next question, but just before I get to that one, what do you think of NICE's statement last week? And if you think of the shared education programme in terms of sociological benefit, that their starting point is actually your end point. That they're starting from where you'd like to be.
Well, not necessarily. I think we may have a range of views on this, but my own personal view is that we think the collaborative model provides an opportunity to work with schools and allow them to maximise the benefit to the young people in terms of cohesion, qualifications, standard experience, and all the rest of it. We think that many schools, once we talk to them about collaborative model, are very enthusiastic about it. Every school that we've worked with virtually has found it to be a very, very positive experience and like to run with it. And with only a limited level of support are prepared to do some amazing things. At some point in the future, schools may decide this is working so well, they just want to keep it like that. They may decide at some point in the future this is working so well, let's become an integrated school, but I don't want to prescribe any future for that. That's up to schools. From my point of view, we can do something now which they find valuable, and in future they can decide what's best for them going forward. But that's a matter for the schools. I don't want to say this is all about getting to a particular endpoint.
I think just to follow on from that, our position would be kind of theory-informed and evidence-based, and it's this idea that we know that sustained contact works in terms of changing attitudes and behaviours, and there are a range of opportunities within our education system to promote that, shared education being one of them. We're not, as Tony says, prescriptive in terms of where we see this ending up.
Okay. Just bear with me, Chairman, just on the figures, because you said, Tony, that the most optimistic projection for integrators would be about 10% of the school population. But in your paper, you say that officially designated integrated schools account for only 4% of overall provision. Well, that's not right. The schools are 4% of the schools, not the number of pupils attending them. Surely the figure you should be working on is the number of pupils, the percentage of the school population. Well, that figure only applies to the schools in the report, and we checked it before we provided. Well, I'm even quickly trying to work out what 62 is as a percentage of 1,150. I think you'll find it's more than 4%. It's getting more like 6%. But, you know, I mean, just for the record, the correct figure in terms of school population and officially designated integrated schools would be just touching 7%, I think.
Pupils,
Of the pupils.
Pupils, yeah.
Yeah.
And, I mean, is your 10% schools or pupils, Tony?
Oh, no, well, it's IES target, 10% of pupils.
Pupils, yeah. But, I mean, if it's 7% at the moment, and that doesn't include the naturally integrated schools. We all know where they are and who they are, who are not officially designated, but actually are effectively very much shared schools, you know, with a healthy population which would easily qualify for integrated if they cared to apply for that status, but there's no need for them to. They don't need to. If you add those in, well, then you come towards the figure which we often quote about that 90% of our pupils are actually educated solely with their own co-religionists. And that means you've already got this 10%.
It's IES target, not mine.
Well, I know, but you quoted it. It's, you know, I always end up sounding hostile to what you're trying to do, and I'm not, honestly. I hope you will accept that.
Miles can actually talk about the schools that are mixed without necessarily being within the integrated framework.
Chairman, I really just wanted to make a point about the importance of studying integrated schools and comparing them with other kinds of schools, and that is because in a situation in which you have choice, there's always a risk that you have self-selection effects, so that certain kinds of people choose to go to certain kinds of schools and they choose to avoid certain kinds of schools. So there's always the risk that you start from a lower baseline in an integrated school, because the kind of parents who choose to send their children to those kinds of schools may be the people whose attitudes we are less interested in changing. So, you know, taking nothing away from the good work that is done in integrated schools, they will always suffer from a self-selection bias that other schools won't.
I think
Sorry, I was just going to say in relation to the point about those mixed schools. So we've done some analysis of mixed schools that we've called those schools that have between 5 and 10% of children from the other religious group, and super mixed schools which have more than 10%. And our findings for those schools are that they're very effective outcomes in terms of contact. But I would be fairly confident that those schools would not want to transfer to integrated status. They are avowedly, particularly in the Catholic sector.
Not advocating that they do.
Okay, I thought you said.
That's perhaps the best form of integration, you know, the natural, based on demographics and geography and history. That's fine, but and I can't help thinking, Chair, again, that, you know, if we're sitting here in 20 years' time, we'll be having much the same discussion, probably with a much greater input from the shared education movement, but we'll still have Catholic maintained, controlled, integrated Irish medium, hopefully all of which will have a fair degree of sharing involved, and that the integrated twice as big as what it is now.
Well, we would hope in 20 years' time we are in a situation where the taken for granted assumptions about the way schools work have changed, and schools no longer think they can do all the things they need for the pupils by themselves, but they work with other schools. Because I think that will be better for the schools, better for the young people, and the evidence suggests it will be better for local communities as well. And hopefully it will have helped to contribute to the development of a more cohesive and shared society.
Always interesting.
Okay, thank you. And I suppose really from a personal perspective, I went to a single-sex, probably a very much traditional single identity school, and moved to what is now a super mixed school. I moved to Methody, and it was really for educational outcomes, and also the fact that there were boys, so that was probably to be perfectly honest. But it did actually prepare me for life afterwards, and when I went to Queen's, that it wasn't just quite the shock that it would have been, and also then entering into the real world, as to whether this is the real world or not. But I mean, certainly there were positives there for me. But the whole idea of super mix, I think, is it's an interesting term. But I think it's probably quite apt. But I'm not sure that I would have considered it to be integrated. But yeah, we're moving on. Mr. Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I want to welcome you all here to the committee as well. I made a point of welcoming my old university earlier. There again, there was a bit of strain, sort of shared education in our household, because my wife went to Queen's and I went to the University of Ulster. So I don't think Eller University encouraged that, but it just happened naturally. That's
You're dissolving your own
natural
boundaries there.
sharing, Trevor. When we look at education right across Northern Ireland, there's quite an interesting thing I can see there. The controlled sector has examples basically of all types of schools from all sectors actually under that umbrella. Should we be using that as that sector as a bedrock for future sharing?
Well, we're in a situation where we have a range of different sectors and management types. I think that's unlikely to change radically into the near future. So if it doesn't change radically, the question is what can we do to try and enhance and improve the experience of young people in the schools. And that's where I think the collaborative model works, because you can have schools from different sectors working together. I think whenever CCMS were here, they were pointing to, I think it's 4 examples of maintained schools that have a mixed enrolment. There are some control schools, as you say. There's an Irish medium control school, there's controlled integrated schools, there's control schools that have a mix because of circumstance. So there is a variety of different types of schools. Rather than trying to find the single type that works, if we can get schools working together collaboratively in the way that we have done, then I think we can get a very quick win for everyone. And if that becomes, as the Chair was saying, becomes the mainstream experience of young people, then that's the sort of issue we can look at some point in the future and see if schools want to sort of change the structural arrangements in any way. But that will be a matter for schools and parents and teachers and whatever.
Yeah. And Tony, there's another thing which I can certainly see. When you look into the next 3 to 4 years and financially where all departments are going, the importance of sharing, not only across sectors. I don't think the sectors, to be honest with you, will be that terribly important. When you look at how rural some of our schools actually are and how isolated, physically isolated some of them are, and their inability to deliver a wide enough curriculum, do you see huge opportunities there for sharing of education, whether it's internally within sectors or actually more broadly across sectors, in the actual survival of those smaller units, which mean an awful lot to those local communities?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we've been working with quite a number of primary schools, in particular small rural primary schools, that in and of themselves face real challenges in trying to deliver the curriculum. But when they work with their neighbours from another sector, often, then collectively they can do that. At this point, in those situations, very often the schools don't want to explore an integrated option at this point, maybe at some time in the future. So in that situation, collaboration and sharing is a way of them benefiting all of the kids and helping to secure that important social institution in a rural community and helping to keep the community together. So yeah, I think there are many places we know that that is a real viable option, and we hope that the leaders of the sectors and the department see that.
I mean, somewhere like Ballycastle is a perfect example of that.
Yeah.
In terms of the broad range of curricular offer that they can offer together, but alone it's an entirely different picture.
Yeah. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Joanne.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for your presentation this morning. I think there's so much more sharing going on than we ever really realised, and as my time in this job has progressed, just you come to appreciate how small rural, as you said, small rural schools are gaining from sharing the expertise, and even larger primary schools in my area. It's about sharing that expertise across that divide and gaining the expertise in an area. There's more integrated or more sharing than previously expected. Integrated with a small I, I keep saying. But I mean, you've said in your report that there's some groups less inclined to be involved in sharing than others, and what groups are these, and would they be defined by socioeconomic rather than ethno-religious factors?
I'm not sure that we said there were groups less inclined to be involved in sharing. I think that what we were saying was that the outcomes are different for different groups depending on contextual variables. So, for example, I mean, some of our quantitative research has shown that in areas that are very divided, like North Belfast, there are some positive outcomes of sharing, but they're maybe not as extensive as they might be for schools in the likes of Limavady or Ballycastle or some more mixed environments. So I think it was to do with the outcomes in relation to context.
Another point on that is that we have schools at different levels of sharing. They're engaged with each other in entirely different ways, and so it's entirely contextual. In some regards, we have schools who would be described as kind of organic partnerships or emerging partnerships that are at the very early stages. We also have partnerships across Northern Ireland that are heading towards some sort of symbiotic or almost an interdependent relationship with one another, like Ballycastle, for example. So there is a range, there is a spectrum of the way in which schools engage with one another.
Yeah. And I think that's, it goes back to your original question, which was, I thought, interesting, the definition of shared education and how it needs to encompass the wide variety, and that's not a negative, it's a positive.
Yeah.
That we should encourage whatever level of sharing and congratulate them on that, and that it's a work in progress, that changes over time. Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Lunn?
Yes, thank you. I'm going to move away from a normal tack here. In terms of the acknowledged gap between what is produced by the best of our schools and the deficit at the bottom end of the results, what potential do you think there is in sharing programmes for cooperation between the best of our grammar schools and another school half a mile down the road, which is producing the figure of 25%, not even achieving 5 GCSEs? Because I get the impression, that I'm sure I've heard it from at least one representative of the grammar sector, that they're not that much interested in this. I mean, what's your experience of this so far? Because they should be able to give a helping hand, surely, to improve the overall situation.
I think Joanne's already mentioned that some of the survey evidence suggests that there is a bit of a tension between the possibilities of grammar and secondary schools working collaboratively. I suspect that's more related to a broader policy context and people wanting to maintain demarcation lines and clarity, which is unfortunate, but I suspect that's the explanation. I think there's no doubt, if you look at experience in England, where federations and collaboration has been on the agenda for quite a long time, it's largely focused around the issue of school improvement and strong schools supporting weaker schools to try and improve their practice. We've had even things about this week in the news around private schools. Yeah. Public schools working with local authority schools as part of that sort of process. There's plenty of evidence in many different places that's one particular context, but even schools working together and teachers sharing a wider repertoire of experience and expertise is a way of helping teachers to change their own classroom practice, because that's what you need to happen for school improvement to happen. So collaboration does that. It gives teachers this sustained, regular network of expertise that they can dip into, and that's always going to help. So I think you're absolutely right. There is the potential in an environment where there are fewer concerns, maybe around sort of undesirable change, where schools can work in those sort of contexts, could work together, share practice, share expertise, share experience, broaden the repertoire of classroom skills that teachers are working with, and improve things for everyone. I don't know, Miles, do you want to?
I would have just made the point there that some of our other work in other contexts, and this is a particular large-scale European study involving the UK, Germany, the Netherlands and Sweden, one of the things that we're finding there is the positive benefits of mixing for these are ethnic minority immigrant children who are integrated into friendship networks with majority group children. So I think if you can get the schools to collaborate at the right level, I think you can actually use this programme as a first step towards increasing, first of all, the educational aspirations of other children, and then the educational performance. And that's something that we intend to provide at the end of our study. Our study will be a 5-year longitudinal study, and at the appropriate point, we'll actually be able to plug in the school grades and the GCSE scores of children to be able to see some of the hard outcomes of some of this mixing that we're involved in.
Trevor, just on that point, I mean, as a practical example, we have schools across Northern Ireland that are involved in partnership, where you may have a school and this is an example without identifying the schools, where a school has been struggling and the inspectorate has deemed a certain department within the school to be inadequate. And as a result of the collaboration between a maintained school and a controlled school at a post-primary level, the maintained school, with its expertise in science, has been able to help another school pull its kind of grade from inadequate up to outstanding.
Is that a maintained grammar school?
They're not grammar schools, so I'm leaving aside school type, and more talking about where we mentioned that idea of strong, weak. But what's really important is not so much that there's a sharing of expertise from one school to another that has the experience, but when our schools come together, they often look for common and complementary need. So common need are the types of needs that both schools need, and complementary need is the idea of identifying where each school has skills. So the idea of strong weak is reasonably crude, in the sense that when we talked about the school that was struggling, that school also had an expertise in special needs and was able to help the other school in return. So that's the type of relationship that we're essentially talking about.
I can't help thinking, Chairman, that the grammar schools could do a lot to help their image. I mean, they seem determined to cling to a system where they put children through these tests, which some of us despise, and the failures have to go to some other school, but they could at least improve their image by trying to assist those schools. If they're not prepared to accept the children, they could at least give them a helping hand, Well, anyway, that's my rant for today.
Use the F word.
Well done.
Second rant.
Mr. McCausland.
Apologies, I had an appointment. I couldn't get out of it this morning. But I just wanted to ask, in view of all the research and studies that you've done in terms of sharing and children coming together from different backgrounds and traditions, if children come together from a school in the Catholic maintained sector and the controlled sector, they're probably coming from different cultural traditions. Those who are coming from the maintained sector will be coming from a school, particularly at the secondary level, where they probably play Gaelic games, may well have Irish language in the curriculum. We'll have probably a traditional music group in the school, Irish traditional music. So there's a strong cultural identity there. May well not be the same in the control school. Do you see any issues arising from that?
Well, my experience is, particularly in rural schools, that in control schools there's often a very strong tradition of music, particularly centred around bands, pipe bands and such things. And a lot of pupils within the schools, I mean, I've been in schools where the kids are practicing playing bagpipes, for example. I suspect you're right to the extent that there's probably a clearer, more tightly defined cultural framework within maintained schools, but that hasn't been a problem in our experience. What's tended to happen is that the opportunity in situations where people have addressed cultural issues specifically, people have used that as an opportunity just to broaden the experience that people have. I mean, we have had situations where there's been discussions around remembrance, for example, in November, and broadening the experience of children from Catholic schools who traditionally maybe wouldn't have been as connected into that, and addressing some of these sorts of issues, aspects of sort of history and citizenship. Different schools choose to use the opportunity of collaboration in different ways. They focus on different areas of the curriculum. Some of them are more directly related to some of these issues than others. And that's okay, because the important thing is you bring people together in as many different ways as possible, and then as Miles was saying earlier and John's work demonstrates, once you've created that context, that provides an opportunity where you can start to address issues around difference, and you've built up a level of trust that you can start to deal with some of those more challenging issues, and that's when you start to get the evidence suggests you start to get significant change and improvement in the cohesive nature of our society.
Would you not accept, though, that remembrance, while it's hugely important, is not the counterpart of the others? Sure. And that certainly others I've spoken to of their experience of control schools would have not as fulsome a view of the extent of the musical traditions and other traditions. I remember some years ago someone at CCEA saying to me that when they were organising an event, it was very easy to go to a Catholic maintained school to get a traditional music group. And I think there was a school up around Castledurg somewhere had a pipe band.
Right.
There used to be a pipe band in Campbell, I think, but apart from the sort of developmental work that's been done by the Ulster Scots Agency recently in terms of putting music into schools, I don't know of any other schools, barring one, that has a band.
Yeah. Oh no, the school I was in didn't have a band, but there were some of the pupils in the school who played in bands, and so you practiced or allowed to practice in school.
My point being, though, that if a culture is excluded from schools, it is denied the validity of being part of the education system.
Well, is that making an assumption that there is specific exclusion? I don't know that there is. Maybe there is. I don't know. I'm not aware that there is.
Well, if the thing is not there, it's been either intentionally or unintentionally excluded.
Well, it may be that there are other spaces that are available for it. It's
just not pursue the point, just make the observation.
Sure.
For any cultural or linguistic expression right across the whole of Europe, when you look at examples internationally, the two key things are to be part of the education system. Gives you validity, and you get intergenerational passing on, and also part of the media.
In our first wave of shared education schools, there was one a maintained secondary school in a rural context that developed a lot of activity with the network of primary schools, controlled maintained primary schools in its area. And one of the unexpected benefits of that was not just for the experience of the kids, but they started connecting up to all sorts of community organisations, and the maintained school started to be used as a community resource for events and meetings and other activities, including on at least one occasion an event with the Orange Order, where they carried out something in the maintained school because they had a good hall. I'm a little bit vague because I'm not sure, we haven't come across this as a particular issue, but that's just an example where the connections that are created across communities because of the collaborative relationship between schools does have a community impact and helps to provide opportunities for people within communities to come together in ways that previously just wouldn't have happened at all.
No, I've no objection to any of those things. That's good. The fact that even you say you haven't come across it as an issue, I think it's an issue which has been left in the too difficult drawer almost. Right. Or forgotten about. Make the point that children going into a school have a basic human right to learn about the culture and the cultural expressions of the community from which they come, which in many cases would be, as you say, the children playing a band outside, but it doesn't get brought into the school, and that almost delegitimises, marginalises it, which I think is something that, in terms of creating a shared future, better relationships, would be a good thing to actually.
Nelson, as a practical example, and I'm not exactly sure if this is the type of thing you want information on, but in our partnerships, and again I'll go back to the partnership in Derry Londonderry, in terms of culture, in terms of arts, the children have a shared choir that operates both inside and outside of the school. They've engaged in quite a large drama piece involving 150 children, involving 9 schools across the city. And that's again both an expression of activity that happens inside the school and outside the school. We have evidences of shared sports in terms of rugby, Gaelic. The type of research I do tends to be very focused on small groups of young people or in classroom observations. I'm involved in observations where young people talk about their kind of collective identities, common identities. They're talking about their accents, they're talking about language, gender. So it's more than a conversation around culture. It's actually quite a broad and nuanced.
If they're talking about their cultural identities, what I'm suggesting is that in some cases one group of children may be coming forward with a cultural identity that they bring from the home into the school, but which is then reaffirmed and validated in the school. And the other children may be coming from a community identity, that cultural identity that they live in and have outside the school, but it's almost left outside the school gates. That's the point. So therefore you're not getting a level playing field. And I just think that there's potentially there's two dimensions to it. There's the rights issue and then the relationship issue as well.
I mean, I wonder I've actually written a paper on this issue, and it's I think the
Great.
Because they maintain,
give me the title now. Give me the details. So I can
disagrees with everything you said.
But the maintained sector, you know, is the Catholic sector, and there's a strong attachment to kind of cultural traditions and so on within it. I think the controlled sector, because it's open to everyone, and presented in that way, it's difficult then to attach to particular traditions or culture.
Only if you approach it on a school basis rather than a child-centred basis. Once you approach it on a child-centred basis and looking at it in terms of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and the commitments in there that a child has the right to learn about the culture of the community and the home from which they come, and it's to be done on the basis of equity that doesn't discriminate between children and children, so that what happens to children in one educational sector should also be available to those in another sector. On that basis, you know, children, it's an important issue, it's a rights issue. And also, I think you get a better relationship if children come together. But if you could give me the details of the paper, I'd be delighted to read it.
I'll send it to you.
Thank you. Thank you. It was worth coming this morning.
Nelson's happy. Just very finally, I just want to know whether you've done any research around youth service.
Around?
Youth service?
The youth service. You mean outside of school? With a particular kind of focus? I'm not quite sure what you're getting at.
I suppose it's really, I mean, there are opportunities with youth clubs and so on as well for sharing, and I was just wondering whether there had been any research around the level of engagement and sharing in communities.
The closest we have come to it, potentially the contested spaces work in Derry, Londonderry, one of the key things there wasn't just collaboration between schools, but collaboration with statutory and non-statutory agencies. But we have a focus on the particular youth sort of sector hasn't been at this point a focus of the work certainly I've been involved in.
There's other projects within the school that are looking at this. There's the Iliad project, which is investigating links in education and disadvantage, and that's one of the aspects of that project. Now the research is ongoing. It's due to report to OFM-DFM in March, I think.
You know, I just think it'd be quite interesting because obviously there's a focus on schools, and obviously once young people leave school or go out of school at 3:30, you know, what level of engagement is there then after that? And you might find that in some areas it's very high, and there are probably some very good models, and in others maybe it could be encouraged.
There's a very, very long tradition of work within the youth sector, a different type of pedagogy, often evidence of a greater commitment to addressing issues around reconciliation and cohesion, and more the use of more creative methodologies in addressing these sorts of issues. Although one of the things that was always identified as important there was the voluntarist nature of it, so that sometimes it could work a little bit better than in schools because young people had the choice of going to those settings or not, whereas in schools it was effectively compulsory. There were attempts at various points and University Belfast did some interesting work in this where they trained youth workers and teachers together just to try and get some synergies between them, and I think that was successful to a degree, but because they are two different professions there remains some degree of professional sort of tension between them, and I guess that still is the case.
But I think it goes back to that point as well about, you know, how difficult it is for our teachers, or the expectation that we have of them to address some of these controversial issues within the context of the classroom, given that they don't receive training for it and that they're currently educated in separate teacher training colleges. You know, to assume that they will have the capacity to do this or the will to do it, you know, is something that we certainly need to think about.
If I could just add to that, members of your committee may or may not be aware of work on the National Citizenship Scheme in England. It's an idea that David Cameron is very keen on, and I'm not recommending it for that reason. But it is a great idea for bringing together people from different backgrounds, and these are not just ethnic and racial backgrounds, but also deliberately different socio-economic backgrounds. And they get young people from school who volunteer to take part in these activities outside of schools. They take part in a 4-week program that involves, it starts off with some outward bound activities, then they go and get some real world experience of for example, how to market a product. They get people from business involved, something aimed at helping them find employment at the end. They also do some community charity work, and they do this in a team of 12, and they get to know each other. Depending on their team, they get to know people from a particular subset of other groups, and we're actually in the middle of an evaluation of that work at the moment. So I say that to give you faith in the idea that nobody's recommending, I think, that the people of Northern Ireland take this brave step on their own as if there were no evidence ahead of them. There are lots and lots of other examples. People mentioned collaborations also. We also have collaborations in South Africa. We've done similar work in Malaysia and many other countries. And the evidence is there's a huge evidence basis that if you bring people together and you create the conditions of positive contact, the outcomes are going to be positive.
Sure. While this isn't specifically about the youth service, we have some evidence as well of how schools can engage more broadly in the community and build stronger links to voluntary and statutory agencies. Some of the partnerships that I've worked with have made links with youth clubs, for example, where people will use youth clubs in each other's communities. We've evidence of where City Council become involved with schools, stronger links with the PSNI, for example, voluntary agencies like CEOP, other educational groups, community wardens, churches, and historical kind of sites and settings. So there is almost a community development element built into some partnerships.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Lunn would like to come back for a very short question.
I just wanted to go back to Nelson's point about the cultural expression and various types of school, and particularly where he started off was really on the musical side of it. You would know I have a musical interest, and I also go to a lot of schools, and I always ask them what's the extent of music and interest in the school. And with that exception, nowadays, and it gladdens my heart, there has been a resurgence of the teaching of music and the teaching of instruments, and the school has a band or a traditional music group or whatever. But right across the board, and I can't help thinking that it's a good area where there's real scope for collaboration, particularly, because music teachers sometimes are contracted in rather than being permanently employed. So they can teach more than one school at a time, and this is really good stuff. But I don't want to cross swords with Nelson to the exclusion. But really, you can't have it both ways. You can't say that a control school is for everyone, and it's almost the equivalent of an integrated school. So why do we need an integrated school and yet have a Protestant ethos to it? I think maybe it comes down to instruments. Nelson, you want them to be taught the flute and the side drum, whereas they're actually being taught orchestral instruments and proper music.
I find in many orchestras they do actually have drums and flutes. They are musical instruments. But I wasn't going to come back, but I am now in the back. And I'm grateful. Of course, through the chair. I'm grateful to Mr. Lunn for opening the door. Sure, you'll be generous, Chair. One of the best examples of good sharing I came across was at the point where they were having fife and drum classes in the boys' model school, and they were able to bring their fife and drum group together with the traditional music group from Barnegia and perform separately, and then certain tunes together. But they could only do that because there happened to be a group of a particular tradition in each of the schools to come together. If you have only one group, it doesn't work. And that's the issue. And the point that Trevor was raising there about control schools, if it is child-focused, the cultural mix and cultural provision and accommodation within a school in one area, depending on the community that it serves, will be different from a control school in another area. It will depend entirely on the community that it serves. But the children going into the school bring the right with them. It's not something they leave at the door. It's a human right.
Yeah, and the boys' model and Barnegia and Ashfield boys were also involved in the Belfast Cuchullans, where they played hurling and shinty with Scottish shinty teams. So sport, was used in interesting ways there as well.
Okay, I'm going to move now.
I thought the music one was actually a better expression of cultural sharing in that. I haven't seen too many shinty teams around the Shankill recently.
Yeah, well, we had some interesting games in Scotland with the shinty
yes,
teams.
Yes. Could stay there.
I'm going to move now to Mr. Kinnan for the last question.
Thank you, and sorry not to be here for half of it, but I just wondered, had you considered a sort of matrix or a step-by-step sort of continuum of from no sharing to sharing or totally integrated, and having sets of examples that everyone can follow, so that you're pushing it all, knowing that everyone's at different points?
Yeah. There's a continuum, which the inspectors have picked up on and are using as part of the framework that they're organising. I think one of the things we're saying to the inspector is that a continuum is useful because it gives you sort of a guideline as to where people might be at different stages. But don't assume everyone moves at the same speed, and don't assume it's a simple linear model. You can't do step 3 unless you've done step 2, because our experience is that it's a much more organic thing than that. But yeah, the inspectors are using that as part of their framework, which I think is very useful.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I thank you for your time this morning and your presentation, and obviously if there's other information that you'd like to send to us, we'd be very willing to accept it.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.